The earliest piece, I guess, is from 1992 to 93, with the most recent piece from last year. The show is titled after one of the pieces in the exhibition, The Miracle of Burano. Oftentimes, I give my exhibitions titles of the works that are in the shows themselves. And a number of people have asked me, where does the title come from? I mean, it's, I don't know, it's like sometimes I kind of, pause in terms of telling people where this title comes from, because it's not that it's that provocative, right? Well, it goes back to the year 2001. I had created the exhibition of Jamaica for the Venice Biennial in 2001. And we went there for the vernissage, the opening, so on and so forth. And I invited a couple of friends. And this one friend in particular, a male friend, he was having issues with regard to a certain thing. And I'm not going to be very detail oriented with regard to this explanation. And the issue that he was having dealt with sitting down, right? Dealt with pain, cramps, so on and so forth. And at one point we're in Burano, and the friend excused himself and didn't see the friend for about 20 minutes. When the friend came back, I asked the friend, "How did it go?" And he held his hand up and said, "It was the miracle of Burano." And that stuck with me. Oftentimes a statement, a smell, a memory, art historical reference, I mean, they stick with me. And in order for me to kind of get it out of my system, catharsis, what have you, I have to create something that speaks to whatever that thing is. And this was such a case. The piece Miracle Burano, it has a chair in it. I've done a lot of pieces that references chairs. There are several pieces in the exhibition that references chairs. It has a toy truck in it, right? A lot of my works, they look like vessels, or they're the toys, reminiscent of my childhood back in Jamaica. And with regard to this particular piece, it's embedded in the barbed wire, so it's about danger too. The aspect of if you can't just grab it, because if you grab it, you might get cut. So there's always that with regard to some of my work. And so it plays on themes that I've been dealing with over the past 40 years, basically. So yeah. So in a nutshell, it's about the title. If any of you want to see me in person, then I'll give you the fine details. But that's all I'm going to say for now. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I did some perfunctory sort of Googling, and it seemed like there was a different miracle in Burano.
Oh, yes.
Well, which refers to a kind of a stone, sarcophagus that was washed ashore, and a bunch of children,
Right,
with the help of a saint, I think, managed to
several saints. There were three
several
saints.
saints, right?
Yeah, and the saints are now supposedly buried in the sarcophagus, right? So, and it is
Right.
in Burano. Yeah, there are a couple of historic paintings that reference that miracle. I don't think they're called the Miracle of Burano, but there are miracles that happened in Burano.
Right.
So yeah, this work is outside of that. It's besides that. It's like a different kind of a miracle, a more personal kind of a miracle. But it's interesting though, because like I said, a lot of my work, it does reference art history. In this case, it'd be Italian history. I've spent a lot of time in Italy. I won the Rome Prize in 02 to 03. I organized the exhibition of Jamaica in the Venice Biennial in 2001. And to date, that was the first ever, and to date, it's the only time Jamaica has ever been represented in the Venice Biennial. So oftentimes my work, it does reference these historical things, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Maybe speaking of or the kind of broader questions around art history, and maybe Bridget, you would like to kind of respond or kind of take it away and thinking through the works that we looked at and sort of Arthur's practice.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So just to say how honored I am to be part of this conversation. Um, I wanted to say a little bit about that exhibition history, since that's something that I'm so interested in. And so I was thinking about where the exhibition starts, 1992, 1993, and some of the touchstones
Mhm.
for those years. So I first think about the Whitney Biennial in 1993, and a very narrow conception of identity politics.
Mhm.
And I would like to hear from you, Arthur. I'll say it a little bit more, but about the framing of work at that time by Black artists
Mhm.
in the United States,
Mhm.
and a different kind of moment that we're in now, where this is a real moment for Black artists, where they're
Mhm.
having exhibitions that just weren't possible. The framework,
Mhm.
the sense of appreciation, the market value,
Mhm.
right? We're in a totally different place right now.
Mhm.
Um, and I also think about how stultifying the term identity politics was as this kind of catch-all
Mhm.
for most people, and a way to really ignore the complexity of the content and the form of the work. I
Yeah.
feel like looking at your exhibition now, it's such a strong argument against that kind of flattening.
Mhm.
Um, and I want to keep going with this, but I do want to give you, Arthur, a chance just to speak about, maybe do you have a different approach, especially as an artist and a curator, right? Do you have you think about your approach to exhibition of your work differently now than you did then?
Well, I guess the best way to answer that would be, yes, right? Because I've grown since then. The earliest work, 1992, and I say 1992, but these works actually started in the late 80s, right? So it's a time frame, right? That's bottled up. Obviously I was, 30 plus years younger then. I was more spry. I could do a lot more things physically back then that I can't do now. Even though, having said that, I still do all the work myself. This old man is still doing it, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, it goes without saying, obviously, I've always been a Black man in America, right? Right. So the work does touch on Blackness in terms of that. It's not in your face all the time with my work. A lot of times my work is very subtle, even though, they might have knives that aren't subtle and things that might fall on you. There are a lot of subtleties, there are a lot of narratives that are going on all at once with regard to a lot of my work.
Mhm.
Of course, I did see, the Whitney show in 1993, but I had already started on the road, before that, doing what I do. And the thing also is that, I'm a college professor, I'm a teacher, right? So that has afforded me the time and the space to do my thing, so I'm not beholden to a market or a collector or a dealer. So, even back then, when I wasn't a college professor, I was doing what I need to do to survive, right? As an artist and as an individual. So, I've just always done my thing, right?
Mhm.
And it's good for me to see that Karma Gallery is giving me this exhibition, like a little survey of over 30 years worth of work, because I also take it in as a viewer, looking at it out of the context of my studio and seeing how these various items relate to each other.
Mhm.
So that's important for me too, just to see it. As an artist, one makes the work in your studio, right? You do what you do, right? And then when the work leaves the studio, it can become anything, right? And it's out of your control, right? So it's important for me, like I said, to see it out of the context, out of the studio, and to hear comments from people. People say whatever they want to say. I don't have to listen to them, but I do hear them, right? So yeah, it's like I'm always going to do my thing, but I'm always going to be reading, listening to the thought, the mentality, or whatever's, going on at a particular time. And it does inform my work. I'd be lying if I say none of this informs my work, because I'm an individual, like I said, was a college professor who had to be, abreast of all these things that are happening, right? So it does feed into my work. There have been times where I've done research for a particular class. I mean, I was teaching this art appreciation course, and I had to research stupas, right? And I'd seen them before, but I never really thought about what is a stupa. But for this class, I had to research what is a stupa, and that became a piece of mine, right? Stupa, in the about the mid 2000s, right? So basically, what I'm saying, you are what you eat, right? In a nutshell, you are what you eat. Okay.
Okay, yeah, all of that is really helpful. And I do think about, what you said is being able to be a teacher, have a kind of stability, in that way, um, at a research institution, place of learning. And that all of that, I think deep research, and I'm always talking about how artists are researchers, is very much a part of your work. Another touchstone historically before the biennial was what I think is one of the most important exhibitions of the 20th century, which is Mining the Museum and Fred Wilson in 1992. And I think about the way that objects put together can create new meanings, and how that's such a foundational lens, I suppose, to look through to understand your work. Um, I wanted to also just mention a few things, and not take up anyone else's time. David, I know, needs to speak and has plenty of interesting things to say. That I do look at your work and I think about found objects, of course. I think about memory. I think with the net, with the hemp, but also wires, about capture and fugitivity. I mean, some of these things are very personal, I'm sure. And then they're also cultural, and so there's a generosity I find in your work where I feel like I'm seeing, of course, through your eyes, but that you're also able to communicate, the commonality of the objects that you use, the fact that these objects all have memories and that you give them an afterlife, I think is really important. It helps us maybe appreciate things that we see every day and maybe use every day without stopping to think about it. Um, so the repurposing project of your work, I'm also caught by the kind of stillness of the exhibition. But another word could be stilled, because there's so much movement. Everything, it seems like, on its own would spin. The globe would spin. The bottles can roll. There's wheels, there's toys. So in their original functions, they have noise and sound and energy. And then there's another way that you allow us to tune in by making them still. Um, and I wonder if maybe you could talk about, if you think about, and it might not be relevant at all, but sound in relationship to your work.
Yes, that's a good point. Like I said, I'm Jamaican, sound, music is everywhere. And that's part, whenever I'm in the studio, especially if I'm by myself, I share my studio with my wife, Lucy Fradkin, a great painter, right? But when she's there, we have music, but it's low, right? But when I'm there by myself, I blast it. I make these playlists that sometimes they're like 9 hours long that I make myself. I'm not on any platform. I make it myself because I like putting things together, right? So it's really important sound to me. I hear a statement from let's say Jacob Miller, right? If you know who Jacob Miller is, David Scott knows who Jacob Miller is. This great reggae artist that died too young, right? And he might have a statement in there, in a song. And sometimes that statement just sticks in my mind and, I have to make a piece based on that statement. So I write the statement down and then I make a piece based on a statement, just like smell and memory. You said a lot of important things that revolve around my work, Bridget, and I thank you for that.
Thank
I mean,
you.
yeah. The African diaspora is a part of my work, the movement of people from one hemisphere to the next, me coming to this country when I was a kid on May 17th, 1969. Never forget that day. It was my family kind of reuniting, actually. You know, there's one piece, the earliest piece that's in the show from 1992 to 93, you know, is a statement that says, you know, Chester, Alice, Marcia, Erica, and Arthur, take a ride, right? And it was about us coming to this country to reunite with my mother, who had come 3.5 years before to set the foundation and then sponsor us to come. You know, it was also after the immigration bill of 1965, so we were lucky in that regard that this country was opening up. You know, mostly because of white flight, right? You know, so there's the politics that surround that also, right? So, I mean, you know, and if you look at that, the images on the screen right now, what does it look like? It looks like a vessel, right? And I use rope, right? I started using rope in the late 80s, early 90s. I was making all these various sculptures with elements, desperate elements, putting them together. At first, I just tried painting them, but for some reason, it didn't work as paint. But then I remember as a student, going to MoMA in the 1980s and seeing the work of the post-minimalist artist Jackie Windsor. There at MoMA, there's this piece called Bound Square, which it's 4 logs, and in each corner is wrapped in rope, and it just leans against the wall. And that piece is probably over 6 feet tall, but it was really imposing. It always perplexed me. You know, what is this piece about? But when I started making these sculptures in the late 80s, early 90s, I thought of the rope use by Jackie Windsor, right? And when you think of rope and you think of Jamaica, you think of hemp rope, right? You know, that's a cultural reference. Hemp, the ganja plant. So it's a cultural reference. So it has multiple meanings for me. So I started using the hemp rope to kind of bind and, you know, as a skin to bind all these various elements together, right? And then as I went along in my progress, I started to, you know, work off of the rope. In that I started using wire, right? Wire is reflective. Where there's reflection, evil shall not pass. We all know what that's all about, right? You know, and you know, this piece that's still on screen. You know, it's also about color. You know, some people look at this and say, "Oh, there's not that much color there," but to me, there's a lot of color. There's variations of a tone, right? So color is very important with regard to my work, right? I do maybe 4 times as many drawings. There are no drawings in this exhibition, but I do maybe 4 times as many drawings. And in drawings, you'll see more of the color, but my sculpture is all about color also, right? You know, they're about history, they're about color, they're about me. They're telling the story of arthursimms, you know, this guy that was born in the late 20th century and lived into the 21st century. It's not over yet because I'm still around, right? You know, so it tells a story of me, you know, looking at history, various histories, friends, relationships. It's me articulating my ideas of my life, basically. So. Mhm.
Thank you. I have more, but I'm happy to give David if you would like to speak.
Bridget, if you want to go on, or maybe I will just say, maybe I'll just jump in and then you can come. And then you can come back. In fact, wow, I mean, those perceptive remarks of yours, Bridget, and Arthur's fascinating responses. I could just go on listening to that all afternoon. But I wanted Arthur, less to ask you a question than to offer you a kind of provocation. And to think a little bit about, you know, what I've been thinking of as the kind of, or aspects of the aesthetic ethos of the work of yours that I have had the great pleasure and privilege of seeing up close and hearing you talk about. And I'm remembering that the first time I encounter your work is at the Infinite Islands exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum in, I think, late 2007 or thereabouts. And in that context, there are 2 works of yours that, you know, I remember on seeing them immediately blew my mind. And the one was the Globe, the Welt, which was a work of about 2004 or thereabouts. And the other work was Boy from around 2006, 2007 or thereabouts. And you very kindly allowed me to use them on the cover of an issue of Small Axe in 2013. And the thing is, this work seemed to me, as I kept returning to them, animate an idea about you and your work that I want to call something like a vernacular cosmopolitanism. There is something about the work, Arthur, that is both rooted, as you've just been talking about it, rooted in your own histories. But the work always reaches out, as again you've been saying about the way in which you come into contact with the stupa, then you learn how to think through the stupa, then the stupa finds its way into your work. So there is both a kind of opening to world, but always rooted in and rooted through your own locations. And I think there is something really very important about that, which so I want to leave that on the table for us perhaps to think about a little bit, and it's a sense of its diasporic quality. But then the second major kind of investment that I have in your work, of course, is in the Kingston Biennial that was eventually in 2022. And there I solicited work from you, Arthur, that was the rope work, right? That figurative work, which was in fact earlier than Globe and earlier than Boy, from the early 1990s. And one was the John the Baptist piece, the portrait of a politician vomiting, the sexual tension, and portrait of an angry man with a gun. And one of the interesting things for me about a lot of the rope work is its figurative character, and in some sense, the facelessness of its figuration, right? So there's something about you and portraiture that I hope we can also talk about. But I puzzled, even after I made this selection, after I puzzled over why it was that this work so affected me. And I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't. I labored over this, even through walking through the biennial several times. And then when I saw the title of the work presently up in Cremona, I Am the Bush Doctor, I said, that's Arthur Simms. Arthur Simms is a bush doctor. And what I meant earlier by ethos, Arthur, is that there is, to me, something reparative about your work, right? The bush doctor in Jamaican Creole is a healer. And there is that spiritual quality of healing that is, to me, evoked in the work. But I heard you a while ago mention, reference reggae music. And of course, the Jamaican reggae artist who has popularized the bush doctor figure is Peter Tosh. I'm an at a bush doctor from 1978. So I want to say, it was fabulous because immediately something about the inner energy of this rope work became much more clarified for me. I could see something of the internal ethos that animated the reparative quality of the work. So I want to hear you riff a little bit, Arthur, on the sense of the works. You've talked about this a little bit already, of its locatedness, but its cosmopolitanness. Right? And then also the bush doctor, healer, reparative, repair work that the work does, both perhaps personally and perhaps collectively and at a communal level.
I am the bush doctor, one halo. That's where it's up in San Carlo, Cremona now. And, when I became an adult, moved out of the house, and then my parents, they were in Crown Heights, which is like Caribbean neighborhood, Hasidic, and, many different cultures in that, in that area. I went to visit my parents down in Lakeland, Florida. And, my dad was making all these concoctions for his neighbors. He had done it when I was a kid, but of course, being a kid, I didn't really pay attention to any of that stuff, right? So, and then I found out that my dad was in fact a bush doctor, right? Yeah, he would make all these various concoctions and give it to people, and they would work. Sometimes he would take ganja. He never smoked ganja in his life. He was totally against the smoking of ganja, but he used it as medicine though, for its medicinal quality. He used it to make this concoction for a friend who was having issues with his eye, and it helped the friend, right? So again, it goes back to a personal thing, right? It goes back to my dad, it goes back to me, it goes back to Jamaica. So, all this is rooted in Jamaica. It's rooted in the Caribbean, it's rooted in the diaspora, right? Because when I was a kid in Jamaica, I can remember as far back when I was 5, 6 years old, I was making objects. I was making things, right? I was just picking up on what people did around me, right? I mean, Jamaica's a poor country, but people have spirit there. They're very proud people, right? And then rather than having the money to buy a cart, you would make a cart, right? There were no Walmarts there. You just go and you did what you needed to do, in order to survive. And I picked up on that as a kid. And I can remember, and this is no joke, man. It's funny, but it's no joke. I can remember carts, right, with wheels that were almost square that people were pushing, right? And and it's like things like that. Just it's just embedded in my memory. So I'm just picking up on what I saw around me, and that's where I grew my love for creating objects. Then you come to this country. I came to this country. I'm in the 2nd grade. And this kid is drawing, it's around the Apollo launching to the moon. And this kid is drawing a rocket ship. And the teacher said, "Oh, that kid is an artist." An artist, what's that? He's doing things that I like to do, right? So, I guess I'm an artist too then, right? So, so it's little tidbits like that I remember that go into the makeup of me becoming an artist. But it all started, as a kid in Jamaica, and just picking up on those cultural things that were happening around me, and people have said with regard to some of my road pieces that they're kind of ghost-like, right? And they are really ghost-like because I'm remembering, smells and things, and even sometimes people back in Jamaica that I left, right? I had a cousin, man. He was like my best friend. I was this little kid, and I left him in '69 when I had no say. I'm a kid. Leave with your family. You come, right? Reunite with your mom. But then when I got to go back with my mom and go back to the place on Brotherton Avenue where I live, and I was so happy that I'm gonna see, my cousin Jimmy, and Jimmy had died several years earlier, so I didn't see Jimmy, but I don't forget Jimmy though. It's there. And the great thing about being an artist is you can memorialize people. You can memorialize events, right? And, you can record things. That's why, like I said, it's important that this is the ideas, like I say to my student, art is ideas. The ideas of Arthur Sims, who lived in, during this time frame, right? And, you go, you pick up things, you travel, you learn about the halos, in medieval Italy, and it seeps into your work, right? So I like to say to my students, it's all valid. It's all valid, right? So it's there for you to be used, right? And that's my mentality, man. I just love, yeah.
Arthur, that's the thing, that it's both vernacular. So I am the bush doctor, comma, the halo. So your reference, you have this imagination which allows itself to be steeped in what it knows organically in your personal history. But it's never simply there. You're always reaching out for what the world in its complexity and plurality teaches you. And I think that's an amazing thing about it. But you haven't touched on you haven't touched on the healer, that mentality in your own work. Although the Miracle of Burano also has that quality to it, right? There is a kind of, there is, I think, the miraculous in your work.
Well, I'm healing myself, really, as a Black man, as anybody, you go through all this stuff, right? There's all this stuff, there's all this history, right? So it has to come out some way. And this is how it comes out for me, right? I have my friends, I have my family, I have Lucy, that helped me. They helped me, right? But then, there's me living inside of me. And I needed, quote unquote, the religious aspect, right? I'm not a religious person, but the religion, right? So art, quote unquote, is my religion. And that's how it comes out, right? And I've been doing it my whole life. And if I didn't do it, I wouldn't be myself, right? Even if I'm not physically creating something right now, the back of my mind, I'm thinking about that piece after this webinar that I have to go put another coat over this egg that's going to be in a show. You know what I'm saying? So that's always there, right? So you can't help being who you are, right? So, and then it's, also, David, the title for that show and the piece that's in the show is I Am the Bush Doctor, comma, one halo, period, right? So I'm not only talking about the structure of the show and the work, but the structure also of the title, right? Because I think about structure all the time. Like I said, when I'm mixing music, I think about structure. So to me, that's the same thing, it's just putting the title together with the comma and the period, right? The period is at the end of one halo, right? So that all comes together, right?
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you. Bridget or
yeah, I was going to jump in again. I was thinking about, and I think Sohrab in a previous conversation used the word entanglement. And I thought about that with some of the rope work, but other kinds of materials that you're using. And, in some ways I think about a net and fishing, and I think about capture, a violence of capture. But I think there's also something, speaking to the Bush Doctor and what David's talking about with healing, right? There's also, for some of the work, it seems to me to have the function of protection. Like there's an encasement, and I'm struggling to see what is inside exactly. Is this being protected? Is it being preserved? But I also, with some of the work, think about spiders, right? Wrapping their prey. And I think about digestion and metabolizing, and how that might connect with, for me, it connected already with what you were saying about there's the you living inside of you, right? And how all of those experiences you metabolize, they become part of who you are. And I think about that, especially as you talk about childhood, but we also see children's toys and that potential of that's only reserved for children, and that there's a sense of protection and care. And I also think about all those knots, right? I mean, I think about the process, imagining you putting them together, but then also knots as metaphors, and as you're just saying, through life, regardless of your race, everybody goes through all this stuff, right? And we have knots, some have been given to us as knotty situations. Some of them we've created ourselves, but there are ways to bring tension. They allow things to be held. So those were just some other ideas just out of the conversation just now that you were having with David, just the metaphorical and literal qualities of your techniques, I suppose, combined with your personal story is, yeah, it's very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's interesting, the knots, because sometimes when I'm creating my works, I think of the knots, I think of the Pietà, Michelangelo's Pietà, where you have the Madonna. She has, the Virgin, right? The pure face, and she's holding, her son that was slayed, right? And below the beautiful pure face, there's all this ruffle, there's all this knot, there's all this Baroque, right? So sometimes for me, the knot is very Baroque. right? So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about pressure, like, like the title of your show, David, pressure, holding things together, binding things together, the pressure of just being a human being, right? So it's like, so it's multi-layered, basically, is what I'm saying. And a lot of times, my work is just, it has a lot of things going on, even though it might seem, a simple thing just there, but it has the, the possibility, or maybe, is it going to move? Is it not going to move? Some of them will move. If you push them, some of them will fall on you, right? I like to say some of my work has contrapposto, that counterpoise, Italian word. Yeah, chair in the exhibition. To me, that has contrapposto, right? That classical Italian kind of lean, So it's the work has multiple meanings. It really does. It's like, it's all this stuff that goes through my mind all the time. So.
But
yeah.
inflected there also, Arthur, it seems to me, is a kind of mischievousness, a kind of play in the work as well. I mean, I think that we've been using very heavy language to talk about the work, but there is also in a good deal of work. Again, I think of Boy is the first one in which this is just so, it just bursts out in some form. Is that element of play, that element, of movement, but a kind of playful movement, and the kind of mischievousness with which you create the kind of boy on skates with these multicolored bottles around. One's imagination can run riot with that image. So what's the role of play and mischief?
Yeah, well, it's there. My work has humor. And, it's like, it may seem really serious, but some pieces, it's very humorous, and you can tell by the title or looking at it. So, the titles have bits and pieces into the inside of various pieces, when I was a kid, I grew up with all women, right? It was like me and my dad, everybody else was female. I was the youngest one, including all my cousins, and, since you used to throw their shoes at me, get away, you play too much, right? So there is that element, like sometimes, I think Lucy said this, you look like a kid, right? Like a 9-year-old kid, right? She said to me last week, right? So that you can't take that out of me, man. It's like, that's part of who I am in terms of my creativity, right? And that piece, Boy, I mean, I've done 2 pieces called Boy, one from 1987, right? That's based on an Eric Fischl painting, The Sleepwalker, from 1979. That was the first one. That's probably the first piece on wheels that I did. That's on my website. We don't have the image of it. It's on my website. That first Boy from 1987. But this Boy, it refers to African headdress, right? This piece that I saw, the bottles reference this headdress that I saw, and the position of the feet references the Greek kouros, the youth, right? With the step like that, its sculpture is changing, it's moving, right? So even though it's rather playful, it still has these, these historical references to me, right? Or for me.
Right. Very cool.
I was going to ask a question about, I mean, this work and then many other works that we've seen just even in the slides, that you create these platforms, that it seems like each sculpture has a stage, that's not from the gallery. This is something that you're creating these, I'll just say platforms again, but to me, it provides an invitation for theater and storytelling, right? They're not just, and you may have some that are just directly on the ground, but for the ones that I have in mind, there's a lot of these platforms where you're giving them, a stage, a place for them to
To elevate.
to be presented,
A theatricality.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
There is that potential for storytelling, especially for me, because they're found objects that they each have their own histories, right? And then we have to, decipher, what is it? What was it used for? What's its function now? What is that?
Yeah, and they're very specific, these objects. It's not like I'm randomly just pulling things and just throwing it together. The screen is the Miracle of Burano and also Apollo, right? Apollo references classical Roman sculpture, the Belvedere Apollo, the Laocoon, where these figures are just, with their arms just stretched and, things like that. And it's wrapped in wire. And the bottle has all kinds of stuff embedded inside of it that you can see some, maybe you can't see some because they're obscured, right? That embeddedness references, certain African cultures where things are placed inside and only the shaman knows what's inside that belly, you know what I mean? So again, it's a multi-layered, multi-layered aspects that I'm pulling together, create my idea. So yeah.
That's awesome. I
Um,
like that, the belly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of this kind of question about, feathers, wheels, stage, this kind of contingencies. I mean, there's always this question of movement, of becoming, and this like notion of also, essentially thinking about what David mentioned as vernacular cosmopolitanism, or this questions about different forms of becoming, and I feel taking this to the question around more studio practice. Arthur, how and when do you decide a work is finished while always keeping this question of becoming within it? I think it's an interesting sort of tension within the work, and I'm really curious to hear about, when you say, okay, this is done, or does that ever happen?
Yeah, no, it happens, man. I mean, sometimes I say something is done like 10 years ago, and then 10 years later, I'm adding, little bits and pieces to it.
Yeah.
So only time can tell if something is truly finished, right? Like some pieces that are in the show now, I worked on a little bit before sending it out to LA, right? So an artist is always going to see something that maybe someone else doesn't see, or that something that needs adjusting, right? It's like Rouault, the great French painter. I remember hearing the story of, he goes to a museum and there's this painting in his museum, right? There's one of his paintings. So he leaves, he comes back the next day with his paint, and he wants to paint on the painting. And the guard says, well, you don't own it anymore, but to him, it's still his work, right? So I won't work on anything if somebody has it. I'll leave it as is. But it's actually it's a tough question, right? It's a tough question, but because I guess, I can answer that question now because I've been doing it for most of my life. So one can say, okay, yeah, this probably is finished, right? But it's a really tough question, and only looking at a piece over a period of time will tell if something is truly finished.
But Arthur, just piggybacking on that, there's a sense in which that tracks what Bridget was saying earlier about the story, a quality to your work. And insofar as the story isn't finished, right, the work isn't finished. And there are various chapters of the story that perhaps haven't quite been written yet. And so one can see, I think that's a great question about the kind of provisionality of your work, that it lives there and it speaks back to you, Arthur, and then you say, maybe I will add this verse to that poem, or this chapter to this story. I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about your work.
Yeah, it's always, the artist has the right to, to adjust their work, right? We're looking at chair now, the one on the image on my right. I mean, over the years, I've added things to that chair. When I first made the chair in the 1990s, maybe the mid 1990s, it didn't have all that stuff on it. But as time goes on, you think of more, and, you collect more things, you think of more ideas, or maybe I'll put this right here. You know what I mean? So just layering, my work is always about layering. On my left is a dream catcher on the screen. And I believe this is the 4th of 6 dream catchers that I've done. So again, both of these works are themes that I've been working on over a number of years. And the reason why I started creating dream catchers, the first one that I did is 1999 to 2000. Someone had gone to Canada and they brought back a dream catcher and gave it to me. And of course, we've all seen them, but I never really thought of the idea, what is a dream catcher, right? So to answer that question, I started creating my own dream catchers. And actually one of them, the first one that I ever did was in that show at the Brooklyn Museum. It had its own room, and there was a guard that was standing whenever the show was open. There's a guard that stood there because there's a chair in it. And like this chair piece that's on the screen, there are a bunch of items that one could just take it and put in their pocket and walk away, right? So there's that tension, right? Of somebody wanting to go and take it and steal it. But of course, if you take something, you're disfiguring the work, right? So there's that tension too, you know what I mean? So yeah.
But I kind of feel like this kind of what Dave mentions, that's like provisional kind of quality, but it kind of always puts the work in a conversation with the present moment, even while it's constantly informed both by art history and its entanglement with personal history and its entanglement with like the history of the present, you know? And it kind of, David, reminds me also about what you said about this question of demanding new ways to seize hold of futurity, which I think it's always about this question of how, you know, by being in this moment, and I think Arthur's work really speaks to that, is how can we generate new narratives, new ways of possibility? And I kind of feel also speaks to what Bridget was talking about in terms of locating the kind of the work within this kind of contemporary history of exhibitions, which I think another one to add to that would be the 1994 show of Charles Gaines, The Theater of Refusal. And it's like constant question of, you know, maybe also speaking to that mischievous aspect of the work is that you can never completely place the work. So then it's in this constant state of becoming. And I feel like that's really one of an incredible quality that carries in the work. You know?
Yeah, thank you. It's like language; it's always evolving. There's always some new nuance or bits and pieces that come into play, right? You know, so yeah.
In a way, that language also speaks to like stacking. You know, you stack words, you stack objects, you put things together and create this kind of a suggestion toward a totality where it's never really claiming it. David, I noticed you were going to say something.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I am, but you know, Arthur and I are supposed to have a longer formal conversation, so I'm worried about how many things to put in his head.
It's okay. Just go, man. Don't worry about it.
But you know, one of the things that is so clear about the work in the Miracle of Burano show and elsewhere, of course, is the very embodied quality of the sculptural work. They're all they have a kind of there-ness. And you mentioned earlier, I remember you remember you're mentioning this to me when we were hanging out at Goblin Hill, that that you draw and paint more than you sculpt or build or assemble. And so, but most of what folk know of you is through these sculptures. Is that a deliberate kind of decision in terms of how you exhibit yourself, or does the painterly drawing work have a preliminary presaging kind of quality? What's the relationship between the two-dimensional work and the embodied three-dimensional work?
Yeah, they're almost like distinct practices. I never do mock-ups for sculptures or drawings for sculptures. It's a whole other practice. Like I said, like a lot of sculptors, I started as a painter, then I went to wall relief and then to the floor. So I still have those qualities. I mean, you know, so yeah, sometimes it feels like with the sculpture, like I'm drawing in space, right? I guess, you know, one can argue that that's the foundation for me is the drawing. You know, I do lots of drawings. I mean, you know, I didn't do any drawings today because I was doing other things, but I make up for it when I do them, you know what I mean? But yeah, that's the base, I guess, you know, is the best answer to that. And in terms of exhibiting works, I mean, you know, I do like to show the sculptures and the drawings in tandem sometimes, most of the time, like the show in Cremona, San Carlo Cremona, it has sculptures that were created in Italy, in the area in Cremona for that exhibition, but also sent over 7 drawings, including the piece that's titled for the show that I did specifically for that show. That's over 14 feet tall, right? So it's a good dialogue that the drawings have with the sculpture. Some of the drawings, they're very relief-like. And then some of the drawings, they hang in the middle of the room. You know, some of the drawings you can see through, right? They're like X-ray paintings, Aboriginal X-ray paintings, which is an influence on my work too, right? Aboriginal bark paintings. So, you know, to me, they have a life of their own, the drawings, right? But, you know, like I said, it's part of the base of my overall practice is the drawing, but it also is a relief from the sculptures too, because it's a 8-foot sculpture, right? How long does it take you to do an 8-foot sculpture? You know, I could do 10 drawings in maybe like 30 minutes, right? So it's a relief to get away from the sculpture, to do this other thing that's related and not related at the same time. It's just part of the makeup of my overall practice, right? And I can't do one without the other.
Maybe that's the title of the next show, Arthur Sims Drawings.
That sounds good. That sounds good. Yeah, I have lots of them, man. There's thousands of them. So yeah. So. Mhm.
I mean, I know we're kind of approaching the end of the hour. I don't know if there are any kind of questions from people tuned into the Zoom, but one thing I can throw in there just before we wrap up was something that I feel also relates to Bridget's thinking is about this question of portraiture that I think it came up also briefly in the panel. And, you know, Arthur, I feel there are moments you've used direct references to your own image. There are also other characters who come into play. Some are directly referenced, some remain kind of unnamed, but they're invoked. So these like different invocations that happen. And I think I was wondering if you could speak to that aspect of the work, because I feel, you know, Bridget, you've done a lot of work on representation and self-representation. And I kind of was like thinking how, you know, Arthur, how your work and your thinking about that kind of manifests and how that maybe relates to some of the research that you've done, Bridget. I don't know, I know it's like probably a very long question, but maybe briefly we can touch upon that.
No, it's an important question, you know, because I do look at, I mean, like I said before, it's all valid. I look at art as a whole, right? And there are pieces that you can take and, you know, and add to your work. I mean, over the past several years, I've been doing silhouettes of myself, of my shadow, taking images of my shadow and include them in the piece. You know, this black man, you know, the black shadow, right? So references that, right? And that comes from the paintings of Lois Dodd, who was one of my teachers, you know, a great painter, Lois Dodd, right? Also, Pablo Picasso did, you know, those shadow portraits and Jasper Johns, right? So it references those aspects of my research, you know, looking at that, you know, and even with the sculpture, John the Baptist piece, David, that was in your exhibition, that references Gregor from Kafka's Metamorphoses, right? It looks like a giant creature, right? So one of my first major sculptures in the late 80s, 1992, is Lucy Fradkin meets John DeLapa or Gregor, right? And this is 8-foot piece that looks like a giant roach, you know what I mean? So I'm referencing a portrait through, you know, personal history and research and all the things that I've spoken about, right? I mean, there's great figurative art. There's always going to be great figurative art. There's been great abstract art. There's great figurative art, and it's all valid. So that's just who I am, just taking bits and pieces to articulate, you know, my ideas and my thoughts, right? So, but it's all self-referential, though, you know, in the end. You know, it's all, like I said, the story of Arthur Sims, right? This guy, this Jamaican guy, right? also lived in America, traveled here and there, you know what I mean?
Oh, thank you, Arthur.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I mean, I don't know if Bridget or Scott, do you have any kind of last pressing questions? I know we're at the hour, and I feel we can continue much longer. I have like a whole list of other questions, but maybe we can keep it for another moment. But really appreciate this time. Grateful for to be part of this conversation. Really great honor for me to be here. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.